Hi everyone, welcome to DHC202 Global Networks. My name is Theodor Mitev and the title of today's lecture is Apple versus Android, the two futures of the mobile net. The lecture has 4 parts and this is part 1. As usual, I start the lecture with a quick tour through how we arrived here and by discussing key terms and concepts that I will be using in the lecture. But before I go into that, I just wanted to clarify that this is not a lecture about which system of either Apple or Android is better, or which is more aesthetically pleasing, or which you should be using. It is also not a critique of either of the two systems. What the lecture actually is an effort to display the underlying logic of the open source movement versus any type of closed source systems, and to describe what happens when these two logics clash by using the example of Apple versus Android. So actually I am trying here to leverage this fascinating actually existing clash between operating systems, which is useful for us because of the clarity of the image that we receive from it. It's very rarely that you can observe such pure philosophies clashing and in real life and being able to observe the results. So in part 1, in this part, I will quickly cover the themes and concepts that will appear in the lecture. In part 2, I will quickly discuss the competing philosophies between the competing philosophies of Apple and Google's Android. Then I'll make a quick detour discussing the importance of mobile and the appearance of the mobile net, the importance of the mobile internet today and looking into the future, hence why this battle is really important for us. And finally, I will focus on the so-called battle itself, on the clash as it occurred over the last actually 4.5 years. And I will describe the results, and I will try and extract from this useful issues for us, and try and extract the two philosophies based on the way they behaved on the market. All right, so just beginning with one of the first concepts that we encountered in the subject, the internet, this information network that we are trying to tangle with here was built based on first and foremost on an idea about a particular architecture which will be enabling the flow of information. So it's really important to understand here that the reason I'm focusing on this particular concept again and again and again is that the architecture underlining a particular medium, in this case a particular medium of communication, exemplified by the internet, actually formats the type of content that can flow within this medium. And I'm here trying to again point you towards McLuhan's famous dictum, the medium is the message. We also encountered how this distributed network, this distributed architecture is not actually necessary for communication, for global communication to exist and for global communication networks to operate. We encountered the appearance of centralized information networks with these gigantic mainframes forming the hubs. And this is really important because it illustrates this fundamental logics at play, where on the one hand you have a centralized, vertically integrated hub, which actually makes communication very efficient, and on the other hand you have a distributed network based around a distributed architecture, which formats a completely different type of communication. And this is the clash which already existed, as it were, dormant within the network, the information network, starting with the telegraph. And this was something that we were trying to point out. We have the centralized versus distributed information processing, centralized versus distributed computing. And this particular clash came to the fore, as we already encountered in the late 50s and 1960s, 70s, 80s with the appearance of the internet. We also discussed how there is a particular dynamic involving the process of decentralization. It's a dynamic which always involves the periphery of a particular network. So there is, in effect, there is this disappearance of the center, as it were, as a organizing principle. Everything is a periphery. The notion of each and every node being able to broadcast to the entire network and route communication, process information within the network, right? So it's a very particular dynamic involving the creation of a permanent periphery, as it were. And the other side of this same process is this notion of distributed control. So control for this kind of network to appear, for this kind of architecture to exist, control has to be distributed across the network, right? So we have a conscious distribution of control in order to achieve the dynamic of decentralization and to achieve rapid coordination in a distributed manner. We also discussed the appearance of the TCP/IP protocol, the work of Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, and it's a fascinating principle of this ad hoc creation of solutions, improvisation as part of the philosophy behind the protocol, the absence of overarching design. These we encountered were not solutions that somehow were written before the protocol existed, but were solutions which themselves appeared on an ad hoc basis as and when problems were encountered, right? So this is this notion of tangling with the unexpected situations in reality and reacting to them on the go rather than creating an overarching plan. The other thing about TCP/IP on a conceptual level was that this was the only way to achieve success in terms of connecting vastly different networks, vastly different architectures, and therefore creating the early internet, right? So you have to think of it as the glue connecting all sorts of different networks, and this glue is free in terms of its internal logistics, its internal dynamics. Anyone can use, in fact, everyone does use TCP/IP in order to connect to the internet. A relevant notion which we discovered is the open source movement, and we already touched on several of the important victims of that movement. This notion of release early, release often, first conceptualized by Eric Raymond, and we'll discuss this further today. The notion of the permanent beta, the idea of that software has to be free, right? Ideas have to be free, they have to be accessible to everyone. We also encountered this with the work of Richard Stallman, the founder of the free open source movement. And again, you can see here the link to these cyber libertarian ideas, without which the internet today would be quite literally impossible. So when you are going through the materials associated with this lecture and listening to the lecture, also think in terms of these concepts that we've discussed already earlier and try and link them together, because the Android is a perfect example of the amazing success of open source, amazing success of the free software concept, and amazing success of these core cyber libertarian ideas that we already encountered in one of the early lectures. Another two aspects that are really interesting here is the this notion of the feedback loop that we already encountered with Norbert Wiener, and the OODA loop, this concept that was developed by John Boyd, and in the notion of rapid innovation, the notion of this rapid loop of encountering, deciding, maybe failing, maybe winning, and continuing the process on a very rapid level in terms of orientation within the environment. And a great example here is the notion of crowdsourcing. We've also discussed this already. And finally, I want you to also think in terms of this idea of continuous